The weight of the silver tray dug into my palm as I navigated through Manhattan's elite at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. December in New York had never felt so cold, even inside this palace of warmth and wealth. My black bow tie felt like it was strangling me, but I kept my expression neutral. The perfect server, meant to be seen only when needed, forgotten immediately after. "Champagne, sir?" I offered to a cluster of men in tuxedos worth more than my mother's annual salary. One man turned, crystal cufflinks catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. Richard Blackstone, tech mogul, venture capitalist, and according to Forbes, one of the 20 richest men in America. I recognized him immediately from the briefing our catering manager had given us. "The client's VIPs are to be treated with extra attention," she'd emphasized. "Finally," Blackstone muttered, taking a flute without looking at me. "What's with the service tonight? I've been dry for 10 minutes. I nodded apologetically. "Sorry for the delay, sir." He might have let it go there. Just another forgettable interaction between the served and the server. But something made him really look at me then, his eyes trailing from my dark features to my name tag. "Marcus," he read aloud, his pronunciation exaggerated as if testing a foreign word. "You from around here, Marcus?" "Yes, sir. Born and raised in the Bronx." This seemed to amuse him. He turned to his companions, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass. "See, this is what I'm talking about. Local talent." One of his friends, a balding man with a permanent smirk, chuckled. "Seems to be working out for the catering company, I suppose." Blackstone swirled his Dom Perignon, studying it with more interest than he'd shown me. "Though statistically speaking, garrotos like you are forgotten in 5 years. Not even a footnote in history." The Portuguese word for boys slipped into his English with deliberate condescension. He'd assumed I was Brazilian or something. Not that it mattered. The message was clear enough. His friends laughed as if he'd delivered the punchline to a hilarious joke. I stood there, tray in hand, invisible yet exposed. Every instinct told me to walk away, to swallow it down like I'd swallowed every other slight. But my feet wouldn't move. "Will there be anything else, sir?" My voice emerged steadier than I felt. Blackstone seemed surprised I was still there. "No, that'll be all." He waved me away with the flick of a manicured hand, already turning back to his conversation about market disruptions and quarterly projections. I moved through the crowd mechanically after that, offering champagne, collecting empty glasses, performing the dance of servitude with practiced precision. But inside, something was cracking open. Not just anger, but something more dangerous, clarity. I thought about my mother, Lucia Rivera, who'd crossed the border from Mexico 27 years ago, pregnant and alone, who'd cleaned offices at night so she could take English classes during the day, who still worked 3 jobs at 52 because her son, the first in our family to go to college, needed help with rent while interning at a community development nonprofit. I thought about how she'd never once complained, even when her hands cracked and bled from industrial cleaning chemicals. How she'd kiss my forehead every night and whisper, "Suena grande, mi cielo. Dream big, my sky." The gala dragged on for 3 more hours. Speeches were given about innovation and the future. Awards were presented to people who donated millions they'd never miss. Blackstone himself received a humanitarian award for his foundation's work in urban development. Gentrification projects that had displaced thousands of families like mine from their neighborhoods. By the time I clocked out at 2 a.m., snow was falling heavily outside. I waited 40 minutes for the delayed 4 train, shivering on the platform, Blackstone's words playing on repeat in my mind. "Garrotos like you are forgotten in 5 years. Not even a footnote." I got home to find Mom asleep on our worn couch, still in her housekeeping uniform, a half-finished job application form for a morning shift at a bakery on the coffee table. I covered her with a blanket, careful not to wake her. for hours before she'd be up again. As I stood there, looking down at the woman who'd given everything so I could have a chance, something hardened inside me. Not just determination, a white-hot certainty. I wouldn't be forgotten. I would make sure of it. And Richard Blackstone would remember my name. I didn't sleep that night. By 6 a.m., I was hunched over my laptop at our tiny kitchen table, the glow of the screen illuminating my mother's confused face as she prepared for her morning shift. "Mijo, you haven't slept?" She touched my shoulder, concern in her tired eyes. "I had an idea, Mom. My fingers hadn't stopped typing since I got home. Remember that community center project I mentioned? I think I found a way to make it work." The nonprofit where I interned, Bronx Urban Revival, had been trying to convert an abandoned warehouse into a skills training center, but funding had dried up. My plan wasn't revolutionary, just desperate and clear. Combine microloans, community ownership shares, and corporate matching funds in a structure no one had tried before. "Because no one thinks people like us can manage our own resources," I muttered, sketching financial projections that would have made my economics professor proud. Mom placed a cup of coffee beside me. "What happened last night, Marcus?" I looked up, meeting her eyes. "Someone important told me I'd be forgotten. That people like us don't matter." She stiffened, the weight of a lifetime of similar dismissals evident in her posture. Then she straightened her uniform and kissed my forehead. "Then show them why they're wrong." She grabbed her keys. "I raised you to build, not to break." After she left, I emailed my proposal to Diane, my supervisor at the nonprofit, a woman who'd climbed from the projects to an MBA and returned to help her community. Subject line: "We can do this ourselves." Her response came within the hour: "My office. Now." I arrived expecting resistance. Instead, I found Diane sitting with 2 board members, my proposal printed and marked up with notes. "This is either brilliant or insane," she said, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen before: possibility. "Either way, I want you to lead it. But I'm just an intern." "Not anymore." She slid a contract across the desk. "Project coordinator. It doesn't pay much, but it's yours if you want it." I took the pen she offered, my hand trembling slightly. 5 years, Blackstone had said. I had just started the countdown. "This is the 3rd time they've rejected our permit application," Diane sighed, dropping the letter on my desk. 8 months into Project Revival, and City Hall was proving to be our biggest obstacle. I'd grown accustomed to the taste of disappointment, but this one stung. We'd already secured initial funding through a patchwork of community investments. $50 here, $100 there from families who could barely afford it, but who believed in what we were building. People from the neighborhood had started calling me the architect. Though my designs were financial, not physical. "They're saying the building doesn't meet code requirements for a training facility," I said, scanning the rejection letter. But these requirements weren't mentioned in the previous rejections. Diane leaned against my desk, arms crossed. "You know what this is about, right? Developers have been eyeing that block for years. Someone's pulling strings." I thought about those developers. Men in suits who looked remarkably like the ones who'd laughed with Blackstone that night at the plaza. Men who saw neighborhoods like mine as investment opportunities, not homes. "Then we changed the game," I said, reaching for my phone. "Remember Miguel from the community board? His cousin works in the buildings department." "Marcus," Diane warned. "We need to be careful about." "About what?" "Playing by rules designed to keep us out." I stood up, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. "I'm not talking about anything illegal. I'm talking about knowing the system better than they do." 3 days later, I was sitting across from Deputy Commissioner Rodriguez, meticulously walking him through every code requirement, every safety regulation, and how our plans not only met but exceeded them. I'd stayed up for 48 hours straight preparing, fueled by coffee and what my mother would call Turquidad Rivera. Rivera stubbornness. "Mr. Rivera," Rodriguez said finally, removing his glasses, "I've rarely seen such thorough preparation for a community project. This isn't just a community project, sir. It's the difference between my neighbors having futures or being displaced." He studied me for a long moment. "You know, my father was a janitor in buildings owned by men who never learned his name. I remember how that felt." He signed the approval form and slid it across the desk. "Don't make me regret this." That night, standing in the empty warehouse with Diane, I ran my hand along the crumbling brick wall that would soon become classrooms, coding labs, and workshop spaces. "You know, when I hired you, I thought you'd do the paperwork and maybe bring some fresh ideas," Diane said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I didn't expect you to become this." "What's this?" I asked, turning to her. She gestured vaguely at me. "Someone who doesn't take no for an answer. Someone dangerous." I smiled at that. Dangerous to who? To anyone who thinks they can write off places like the Bronx. To anyone who thinks they already know how this story ends. She tossed me a hard hat. "The contractors start tomorrow. Try to get some sleep for once." But sleep wasn't part of my equation anymore. On my way home, I passed a newsstand with Blackstone's face on the cover of Business Week. Something about revolutionizing urban spaces. I bought a copy and tacked it to my bedroom wall. 3 years and 4 months left on his clock. And I was just getting started. 5 years to the day after that night at the plaza, I stood backstage at the Kennedy Center, adjusting my tie. Not a rental this time. The National Innovation in Social Enterprise Award wasn't something I'd been chasing, but the recognition meant funding, partnerships, expansion. Things we desperately needed. Project Revival had grown beyond that first warehouse. We now operated 5 centers across 3 boroughs, had trained over 3,000 residents in tech skills, helped launch 200-plus small businesses, and created a community investment model being replicated in Detroit, Baltimore, and Chicago. "Mr. Rivera?" 2 minutes. An event coordinator with a clipboard smiled at me. I nodded, thinking about how much had changed. Last week, the New York Times had run a feature calling our work a revolution in urban economic development. The headline had made my mother cry. She was sitting in the front row tonight, wearing the blue dress she'd saved for months to buy, looking so proud it almost hurt to see it. And now, the National Innovation Award goes to Marcus Rivera, founder of Urban Revival Initiative. Walking onto that stage, I felt strangely calm. The lights were bright, the audience a blur except for my mother's face. I placed my speech notes on the podium, then set them aside. 5 years ago, a very wealthy man told me I'd be forgotten. That people like me, from neighborhoods like mine, with names like mine, were footnotes at best. My voice carried through the hushed hall. He wasn't entirely wrong. History is written by those with the power to write it. I gripped the edges of the podium. But what he missed is that sometimes footnotes matter more than headlines. Sometimes the most important stories are told in the margins. I spoke about my mother, about the families who'd invested their hope and hard-earned money in our centers, about the grandmothers who brought homemade food to our construction sites, about the teenagers now heading to college with scholarships and coding skills. We didn't build this to be remembered. We built it because no one else would. Because our communities deserve investment, not extraction. Because dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. As I finished, the audience rose in applause. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my phone, which had buzzed just before I'd walked on stage. A text from Diane. Blackstone Foundation wants to meet. They're interested in funding expansion to 20 more cities. I smiled as I accepted the award. I didn't need his money or his validation, but there was a certain poetry to it. The man who deemed me forgettable now wanted to associate with what we'd built. Later that night, back in our old apartment in the Bronx, Mom and I sat at our kitchen table eating leftover empanadas. My award sat between us, catching the light from our flickering overhead bulb. "You proved him wrong, Mijo," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, Mom. We proved him wrong. All of us who were supposed to be forgotten." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "So what happens next?" I looked out our window at the city lights, thinking about all the other footnotes out there. All the people with dreams bigger than the boxes they'd been placed in. Now, I smiled. Now we write the rest of the story.